Good afternoon. My name is John Prydish, and today we are here as part of our best practice series discussing supply chains are broken, now what? Using ERP data for risk and decision support. As I mentioned, my name is John Prydish. I'm the president and CEO of Success Partners. We're an ERP consulting firm with locations across North America. Success is a full-service consultancy firm for mid-sized manufacturers and distributors. We have a passion using practitioners to help deliver business improvements that help our customers leverage best practices. Today with me, joining me today as my co-host, as main presenter, is Hugo Fuentes. Hugo, would you like to introduce yourself?
Hi, John. Thank you for having me, and thank you for your time today. Yeah, so I've been in supply chain for around 20 years. My last two senior roles were as a VP of Planning and Procurement for Factors Group of nutritional companies, a manufacturer of vitamins and supplements in Vancouver. And previous to that, I was Director of Supply Chain for Finning Caterpillar. And lately, I've been working as a supply chain consultant, particularly helping companies to implement sales and operations planning, as well as, supply chain data analytics. Currently, I'm the CEO at the OWL Solutions, and the company is a supply chain data analytics company based in Waterloo, Canada.
Thank you, Hugo. So we're going to talk about our agenda today, which is really a back to basics and fundamentals. We're going to feature the SCOR model from Apex. We're going to talk about key performance attributes that every manufacturer should monitor regularly. And, the fact is, we're going to highlight the idea and the concept that supply chains have actually been broken before. And what have we learned from those? What can we learn from those? And how will we react in the future now that this is becoming perhaps, potentially, a more regular occurrence? I think it's important with any presentation to talk about some practical applications. What will this data yield? What data do I probably have or likely to have? And what can I do about improvement? What are some of the fundamentals, going back to that SCOR model, as to what would be important to measure? And then we'll talk a little bit about some success stories who've been leveraging business data, ERP data, for better decision making. And then finally, we'll wrap it with a product offering discussion, which speaks to how you might take a step forward and potentially leverage an opportunity to move yourself further down this journey. We'll have a Q&A and discuss some action items. So thanks everybody for joining us. I'm going to hand it over to Hugo.
Thank you, John, and welcome to everyone that is joining our webinar today. We appreciate your time. We appreciate your interest to open a dialogue. We're going to share some thoughts, and the objective of this session is primarily share some perspectives with you, and also hopefully get some of your questions, your concerns, your comments, and being able to answer to those comments at the end of the session. So one of the things that I would like to start with and is opening a dialogue regarding this concept of getting back to the basics. And I'm sure that there could be people in the audience that is very familiar with some of the concepts that we're going to share, at least in the first slides. And but I think it's always a good idea to refresh some of the concepts that are around best practices, and particularly in supply chain operations. So the first thing that I wanted to share with you is just to put a little bit of things in context, is about the SCOR model. So the SCOR model, as you see here, it stands for the Supply Chain Operations Reference Model, and it was invented by APICS, the American Production and Inventory Control Society, many years ago. Actually, it's not a tool, it's not something that is new. It's been around for quite a long time. And for some of you that not necessarily are familiar with APICS or SCOR, we're gonna dig a little bit more into this. But APICS primarily is the Association for Supply Chain Management, and it's a non-for-profit international education organization based out of States. So, and for 20 years, and I think the first time, Apex released this, the first version of this SCOR model was actually back in 1996, so around 20 years ago. And so they released this first version of this model, which is primarily a model that sets some of the standards, sets a framework for what it is considered, best practices around supply chain and supply chain excellence in general. So here's a picture that represents, how the first version of this model looked like back in 1996. So you can see here that primarily what Apex and SCOR are presenting is a model where they see every supply chain primarily is organized around some of the concepts that you see here. So number one, pretty much every supply chain in every single industry, you can tell that at least have some of the elements that you see in this picture. So when you operate in a supply chain in a company that requires a supply chain, let's say a manufacturer, a distributor, so you have normally people, or you have a process to plan. You to plan your demand, plan your supply, plan your inventory levels, etc. You also have activities around sourcing. So you have to source primarily materials. You have to interact with suppliers. You have then once you source those materials, you convert those materials into finished goods. So therefore, that's what Apex called the make step in the process. Then the next step in that framework that Apex put together is the delivery process. So when you're shipping out your products to your customers, that's an activity that Apex considered as pretty standard among multiple supply chains and multiple industries. And also you have some return flows that whenever your customers return product to you, or you are returning some materials or packaging components to your suppliers. So therefore, it's a way to conceptualize how every supply chain in general, and the multiple activities, the framework, the building blocks that every supply chain has. And you can see from this picture that definitely, there's an extension of your company supply chain into the supply chain of your suppliers, the suppliers of your suppliers, and the other way around. So so towards your customers and towards the customers of your customers potentially. So similarly, and if we look at this model approximately 20 years later, so the latest update of this model actually is the version 12, number 12, that it was released by Apex back in 2017. You can see that, even from a picture standpoint, a snapshot, I mean, both seem very similar, because actually, in fact, after 20 years, at least from this concept, from this original concept, things hasn't really changed dramatically, at least from what Apex stands as the best practices, how to organize the different building blocks and around this framework. The only addition in that last model presented back in 2017 was the addition of the enable aspect, which primarily, the Apex is now saying that in order for a supply chain to operate efficiently, there's a series of processes that need to happen in order to manage your supply chain better, such as things like your business rules, your performance rules, your data as an asset in your organization, so the regulatory environment and compliance, and multiple things that are enablers of your supply chain strategy. So, John, what do you think about this, particularly this evolution and the concepts that are, although there seems to be relatively old, are still, prevalent in the organization? What's your point of view?
I think it's a lot like ERP, the concept of a closed loop system. Some industries require, if I'm in the auto sector, if I'm in med device, I'm validated against my ability to support and manage. So if I'm in an ISO regulated environment, some of this isn't new. But for those who are thinking, hey, I think we've got a really good system underway, I think this consideration and the maturity of this model goes a long way. Here we are 11 years later, actually 20 years, sorry, 21 years later, how time flies. And so, I think everything is evolving, and I think data, everyone talks about big data and the value of data. I think this is really starting to action and measure and use that measurement data to help run your business. So I think it's very valuable.
Excellent, excellent, exactly. So that's the purpose of this model. So in a nutshell, and as I mentioned before in the last picture, if you think about your existing supply chain as a company, let's say you're a manufacturer of electronics, as an example. So you can start looking at your processes from the perspective of different building blocks in your supply chain. So from a process standpoint, as I mentioned before, so you will have activities around planning. So you're going to plan your demand, you're going to plan your manufacturing. So planning is a fundamental building block in pretty much any supply chain. Then you have the sourcing activity. So your procurement people, your buyers, your sourcing people, they are the ones that are primarily executing, the sourcing function. Then you have the make function, so people manufacturing, transforming those materials into finished goods or into semi, finished goods. Then you have also the delivery function. So here, all your logistics people, transportation, warehousing people, and people that takes care of that step in the process. And finally, the return. The return process is kind of similar, normally falls under, the delivery function. So logistics, warehousing, transportation, and finally, the enable function, which is, this building blocks number 6 that was added in the latest version of Apex. That's primarily all those processes that support the execution of, the plan, source, make, delivery, and return in your supply chain. Now, when you think about the key performance attributes that pretty much every manufacturer or distributor that operates a supply chain should at least consider evaluating or assessing, right? And on a regular basis, you can see, and that's, again, this is the SCOR framework that Apex suggests, and that we believe that is a very strong foundations for companies, is to, number one, think about things like reliability. How reliable is your supply chain? And so from a performance standpoint, so measuring and understanding how reliable is your supply chain is a key concept. And we're going to explain the next slide with a couple of examples, concrete examples, how that reliability gets measured or get assessed. But I think it's important that, somehow SCOR is telling us, if you have to measure something, think about measuring reliability through your process. The second thing that they're suggesting to measure is responsiveness. So and we're going to elaborate more about that, but think about the agility of your company, the agility to react and be ready for let's say a sudden spike in demand or a drop in demand, such as the one that many companies have been seeing and experiencing over the last few months. Number 3 in this case is agility. So what Apex, also, provides as a framework to say it is really important to see and think about the agility of your process. How agile is your process in terms of the ability to, again, adjust to fluctuations in your business. Number 4 is cost. Definitely, a very important performance attribute in any supply chain. So thinking about the total cost of your supply chain, and we're going to get into that discussion a little bit more, but primarily, Apex says you have to have some ways to monitor and track regularly the total cost of your supply chain and your efficiencies. And finally is the assets. So performance attributes that definitely speaks about things like your inventory levels. So how are you managing actually internally your inventory levels, as well as any other assets that you have in your organization, such as your machines, if you're a manufacturer and you would like to increase the utilization of those assets. Definitely, Apex is saying there's at least those 5 key components that need to be assessed on a regular basis to make sure that your supply chain is performing according to your expectations. So in the next slide, a little bit more detail about this. Sorry about that. There you go. Thank you. So think about, a little bit more detail about what I just described, but in a nutshell. So reliability, so it's the ability to perform tasks as expected. And reliability are things like, for instance, when you measure, your on time in full delivery to your suppliers, so your customers or your suppliers are, delivering product to you, you would like to measure how reliable those suppliers are. So therefore, metrics like on time, measuring the right quantity, the right quality are elements of reliability of the supply chain. In terms of responsiveness, we're talking about the speed at which tasks are performed. So in this case, for instance, the cycle time, how long it takes to procure different raw materials, how long does it take to produce some products, how long does it take to ship those products out, counting from the moment that you receive the order from your customers till you ship that out or you deliver that product to your customers in their warehouse. So things like that. So that speaks to your responsiveness as a business. Then we talk about agility. So agility is the ability to respond to those influences and external influences and react quickly to those, right? So it measured primarily, our flexibility and adaptability as an organization. In terms of cost, so it's the total cost of operating the supply chain. So, and that includes things like labor, material costs, the management and transportation cost. And a typical, metric is the cost of goods sold that normally we see in our, P&L statements. And finally, the asset management efficiency, which is, as I mentioned before, so things like, your inventory coverage, the days of supply that you have in your operation, your capacity utilization. So things like speaks to, how efficiently are you utilizing your assets.
Hugo, my observation there would be that, some 30 years later, by the way, my math was a little off, and I'm robbing myself of since 96. But the point what I observe here is that, in 96, it was about 96, 97, in the 90s, having a standardized way to manage your supply chain and about the tools, about the ability to actually have the visibility and controls in place. But just like ISO has evolved, we're now, with enabling, we're actually helping clients understand the feedback loop and what does it mean to me. I think as we've seen, learning from the information, acting on those learnings. And I think that's what I'm seeing here is a greater focus, not just on the fact that you're capturing that information, but actually moving it forward.
And I think that's a very valid comment. And we're going to share that through the presentation too, in a sense that, companies, I think most of companies have, a lot of data available, right? And they have been able to create that data through the collection of many things in their ERP or any system infrastructure that they have. So, but the challenge or I think the invite that I think Apex and SCOR is how do we utilize that information to make better decisions, better management decisions in your company. And I think that's kind of, the key challenge that a lot of companies, I think, that experience in terms of how do we do more? How do we do more with the tools that we have, with the data that we have? And I think that's what we wanted to share a little bit more insights on how to transform that data into something that really provides value to your organization. So next slide, and I know that the title that we invited this webinar is "Supply Chains Are Broken," and I think what we have seen over the last months definitely has been a challenge for many supply chains I mean, some supply chains have been better, and some companies have been better prepared than others to confront, the challenge of this health crisis. But in general, I would say that this is not the first time, and it won't be the last time, definitely, that we're going to experience disruptions. And as a matter of fact, I'm going to share a couple of slides here that I think helps the purpose of reminding us that we are in a sense our supply chains are fragile, and there's opportunities for doing better there. So and here I put together some information coming from the World Economic Forum, and that it says that primarily, disruptions have been increasing. So if you think about, environmental disasters that, have happened over the last number of years. So since 2012, the number of environmental disasters have increased by 29%. Disruptions due to environmental disasters. And North America in particular has been the worst affected region by those environmental related supply chain disruptions. And most of them driven by things like hurricanes and wildfires. The third thing in this point is that, particularly looking at the automotive industry, and this is sort of an interesting comment too, that only factory fires and company mergers caused more supply chain disruption than hurricanes over the last number of years. I was a little bit, I wouldn't say shocked, but surprised by the comment regarding company mergers. But I guess it's, all that interact and integration process definitely creates a lot of supply chain disruption too. The other element, just to share with the audience, is, when disruptions are measured by the number of suppliers affected, rather than the number of individual events, the four most significant triggers in 2017 were in this order. So hurricanes, extreme weather, earthquakes, and floods. And that makes sense. And I wanted to bring, a couple of things to the table in terms of concrete examples of this happening over the last number of years. So the first example could be familiar to some of you, is what happened back in Puerto Rico some years ago with the Hurricane Maria. And in this case, this example is just to illustrate the fact that because of this, natural disaster, there was one concrete example of manufacturing plant of Baxter International, which is actually a top producer of clinical bags and medical bags that are widely used in globally, I would say, but primarily in the States. So the impact of this natural disaster event, at least after a year or even more later, so there were still struggling companies, and the medical system in the States was still struggling, trying to recover from the shortage of those bags. And the reason why is definitely because of the consequence of this natural disaster. The Baxter plant was out of business for some time, or facing a lot of complex supply chain situations. So the question that we may ask ourselves is, are we in our environments, in our companies, are we assessing our supply chain or supply sourcing risk? Is that something that is top of mind in one of the things that we're monitoring regularly, or we believe that our business model sometimes is special, particular, and we found ways to protect ourselves according to that variability? But I think it's always good to ask ourselves, are we evaluating regularly our single sourcing risk or our geographic risk, in a sense that are we sourcing all of our materials, all of our products from one country, from one single geography that increases our exposure level? Any observation, John, there? If you want to add something?
Yeah, I think it's healthy to always have a second supply. I know it's not all that easy in certain validated, certified environments, but recent history, it's always easy to look back and say, geez, if I only had. But it's also a source of competitive pricing, right? That there's always somebody ready to step in. I know a number of industries like automotive and others, do have that nature, whether you're the OEM themselves, right through to the tier 1, 2, and 3 supply base. And in some cases, it's mandated. You need to be able to produce.
Exactly. Another example, and I'm sure that some people in the audience could be familiar with this, is what happened in Thailand back in 2011. So, which is, this flooding, that it was the worst flooding in 70 years in Thailand. And as a consequence of this flooding, there was a huge impact in the supply chain of well-known companies like Honda, Toyota, Lenovo, and other, technology companies that at that time had all their, I wouldn't say all, but, a lot of suppliers coming from that area. And definitely, a lot of impacts in the supply chain, definitely a lot of shortage of components and for electronics, vehicles, and other commercial manufacturing. So again, so the question is that I think we should ask ourselves is, do we regularly monitor our suppliers' performance? Do we really monitor, as I mentioned in the last slide, our exposure to certain geographies, certain single sourcing characteristics of our materials? And I think there are questions worth asking ourselves. I think that's the key point.
And Hugo, on this one, I actually personally was affected by this. I went to buy a car in 2011, and I was told that, hey, it's the fall. Do you wish to buy the 2012 model, which is coming out? I said, what's new? What's great about that? And they said, well, not so great, because the 2012 model will not have a rear view backup camera. And I thought, that's interesting. A global company, an OEM manufacturer of automobiles, is impacted by a flood somewhere else in the world, which causes a consumer product competitive value proposition within their product line. So I think that year they must have had some sort of an impact, be it just customer sat or having to take a step back and say, we're going to retract an option or a feature. So it a good example that it hits from one small supplier all the way through to a global OEM and product suite. So
I think it's a very good example, John. I think, and that's the impact in our daily life sometimes when those situations hit. And so I think the invite here is to reflect and just see whether under our specific conditions, under our specific circumstances as a company, are we at least asking those questions internally? So what I would like to share here is a couple of practical application examples that I think help to illustrate some of the things that we can do and you can do with the data that is available, or should be available in most of the organizations that operate a supply chain today. So number one, I would like to share particularly some ideas regarding how can you as a company leverage your purchase order information, your purchase order data to improve your supply chain process, how you're ready for the next challenge or the next crisis. So the number one thing that I wanted to share here is, and this is a picture that you can see here. This is how, of course in paper, but normally how a purchase order, an average purchase order looks like for any organization that it could be working in spreadsheets without a ERP system in place, or a company that already has one or more than one ERP in place and is looking for how do I add value to the data that I have in my system. So the fields that you see here are, the average fields that you could find in any ERP or in any, transactional system that is recording, your purchase order. So most probably your buyers, the people that works in your supply chain and your purchasing team, they're inputting things like, your vendor information, the address, the city, the country, the payment terms of that particular vendor, the dates, the order entry date when the buyer is creating that purchase order. So the requested delivery date when you are requesting your supplier to receive that order, and the product information in more detail, as well as the quantities ordered and the unit prices. So things like, are standard, I would say, in pretty much every single process. So, okay, you send the purchase order to your supplier, you wait for the lead time and replenishment process, then you receive the material in your warehouse. Normally, the receipt of goods in any organization kind of looks like this. It could be in a paper, it could be in an ERP, but primarily the information that is available are things like quantities received and unit prices, the dates. Similarly, you know, the requested delivery date, and it was an important, which is an important one. What is the actual receipt date in your facility? What is the receipt location, your warehouse, your address, the city, the country? So a lot of information, and I think this is not a complete list at all. So it could be, I mean, much more information than this, but at least I think most of companies operating today, your supply chain, you would have access to information like this. Now, I don't want to get too technical here, but just the purpose of this slide is to, you know, pass the message to you saying, even regardless of the ERP that you operate today, it could be Epicor, it could be or ERP, or it could be even, you know, you're in the process of thinking about, you know, bringing an ERP to your company because you operate in a different environment. So normally the information that I just mentioned to you in terms of the data that could be collected is structured and is stored somewhere in your databases, in your ERP tables. Somewhere is the information gets stored. And normally, you know, the information looks like this. I mean, there's a few tables there that we can definitely combine and obtain data from there. And but the good thing is that with that data that is regularly available in any organization, so here are some of the things that you can do in terms of what's the value that you can extract from all those fields that if they just remain stored, they not necessarily are going to add the value that you're looking for as an organization to improve your performance and see some insights that allow you to improve that performance. So I'm going to just here share some ideas regarding, you know, what are the things that you as a company could monitor regularly to improve your supply chain process performance, particularly talking about purchase orders and particularly talking about, in this example, the procurement process, your sourcing process. So things like reliability, going back to the concept that we shared at the beginning regarding the SCOR model. So definitely your company can implement some metrics to monitor how reliable the supply chain is. And in this case, you could definitely think about things like your percentage of orders that are received in full, the percentage of orders that you are receiving on time, the on time in full performance from your suppliers, all the things that you can definitely measure and start monitoring in the future if you're not doing so at this time, is things around responsiveness. So as an example, responsiveness, you could, with the data that is primarily available in your ERP, you could start measuring things like the actual lead time. So how long does it take in actual terms, not in the parameter in the system, not in the contractual, you know, lead time with your suppliers. I mean, this is a different calculation. This is reflecting your actual performance. How long does it take on average for every material to be, you know, procured? As an example, so lead time attainment and the number of days that you are late as an or supplier is late in delivering those products. In terms of the risk, what is the percent of your the products that you purchase from offshore locations, from particular countries, from particular geographies, and what is the percentage of products that you source that are single sourced suppliers? So suppliers, that materials that you're sourcing from one supplier only, because of maybe sometimes business reasons, and sometimes because you haven't really have the opportunity to explore that and more actively look at that diversity, that supplier diversity. So another example, similar idea, but things that you can now do in the other extreme of your supply chain, I would say. So I started the first example with, the one extreme of the supply chain, you as a company, manufacturing company or distributor, purchasing materials or purchasing finished goods from a supplier. Let's go to the other extreme. Now you as a company serving your customers. So is there any ways that you can leverage your existing data in your ERP or your system to serve your customers better, or at least understand what are your deficiencies from a service standpoint? Yes, I think, and that's exactly the message that we're trying to communicate here, is that, and you can see the screenshot here for you, for some of you that are currently, Epicor users, Epicor customers. Here's an example of a screenshot on how the sales order entry um, window looks like. So a lot of information you can extract from here. So when your people is inputting, a sales order, creating a sales order in the system, definitely a lot of valuable information is being captured. Things like your customer information, the address, the city, the country, the dates. So your sales order entry date, requested delivery date, product information, quantities ordered, and unit prices. And if you combine that information with information about, your receipts, in this case, when you ship out the product to your customers, you will find information like this. So your shipping information, the quantity, the actual shipping date, the ship to location, warehouse, address, city, country, as an example. I mean, the list for sure is more extensive than this, but the thing is, this is valuable information that you're currently collecting. So next question would be, so how can I leverage this information and this data to create some better ways to monitor my performance towards my service levels? Similarly, similar to purchase orders, most of this information is currently available in your ERP. This is how the common data structure for sales in an ERP looks like, combining a few tables in the back end. Exactly, that's the picture. And so from there, similarly, you can obtain key performance indicators or things that are going to allow you to see and get better insights about your supply chain performance around reliability. So your performance now with your customers, how are you delivering the product to them? And responsiveness, things like what is your actual cycle time as a company? So from the moment that you receive that sales order, how long did it take for you to ship that product out to your customers or deliver that product in their warehouse? And what is the number of days that you're late, as an example? So let me share, one success story of, an implementation of, or a company that has been implementing some of those, some tools to leverage their existing ERP data for better decision making. So this is a company, just to provide a little bit of context, this is a mid-sized manufacturer of consumer packaged goods. They are managing around 3,500 different raw materials and packaging components. They primarily produce around 1,000 different finished goods. They implemented an ERP solution roughly 10 years ago. And what was their problem? What was the problem that they were somehow facing? So number one, they didn't have performance metrics. So for supplier management, so decision about vendors were primarily based on gut feeling, and instead of in utilizing actual data, actual facts. And they had some previous attempts to create metrics, but those attempts were based primarily in Excel spreadsheets, and it were unfortunately time consuming, difficult to maintain, and over time required a lot of effort to update that information. So the team was a little bit, they were definitely overwhelmed because they wanted to keep, creating those metrics, but unfortunately, it was very time consuming and not really effective. So, I mean, we help, this company particularly to implement and bring some solutions that are, number one, easy to implement. And that's one of the things that, we normally tell our customers and our prospects, in a sense, that solutions that can be easily implemented, and also solutions that are affordable, that are not really requiring, a huge investment from our customers. So benefits that you can achieve by deploying some of those analytics that read your data natively and allow you to convert that raw data coming from an ERP or even from multiple spreadsheets, convert that data into analytics that allow you to tell the story of your performance and understand the story of your performance better. So benefits that this company in particular, achieved after implementing solutions like this. So number one, definitely real-time supplier management. So the opportunity to really measure the performance of your suppliers real time, and not, once a month, not only once every quarter. So now really looking after this regularly. It created for this particular company an example, approximately 20 percentile points improvement in their supply reliability, just because I think visualizing things is a magical thing. I mean, when you start looking at things with a different angles, with different level of detail and granularity, and now that people have more time to analyze information instead of creating the information, I think magic happens, and that magic translates into better improvement performance for companies. So in this example, 20 percentile points improvement in the supply chain reliability, and also a 10% reduction in actual lead time. So they were able to start looking at how the theoretical lead time compared to the actual lead time, and improve that responsiveness to their suppliers. And finally, in terms of return on investment, as I mentioned before, given the nature of those solutions that are primarily subscription based, so it doesn't require a capex investment. So so return on investment in less than 3 months, which is also a very good thing to share. So key takeaways out of this, and I think again, we're just trying to share some food for thought, and kind of create that reasoning, that questioning, and that perspective. So number one, what doesn't get measured, it hardly gets managed and improved. John, I don't know if you want to add something to this statement.
Yeah, I think it's really key. If you're not measuring it, you can't manage it. And I think, we'll talk a little bit more in this presentation about the journey of awareness. When you don't know what's happening, it's really tough to climb the hill to a more advanced state where you can actually predict the future. And supply chain people are supposed to be able to do that. It's what the crystal ball that they are supposed to possess, when really it's about good, solid information.
Exactly. So next one, I think a lot of companies operate in a more reactive mode, which means you get surprised by something that happened. I think try to find the tools and the ways to improve your moving this from reactive to proactive mode is something important. So I think the constant monitoring of the key performance attributes, as I mentioned at the beginning of the presentation, is relevant for organizations today. The other thing is that most of companies already have or may have all the ingredients in terms of the data that is available in their existing system. So it's not, many companies think, and many executives or decision makers believe that, I need to bring a new fancy tool, or need to, bring a new, data collection, or change my data collection strategy with a multiple, IoT technology. IoT technology is great for people that is primarily at a certain level of maturity, that they could potentially capture the value of that solution, those solutions. But it's not 100% a requirement. You may start with even what you have today. So how do you leverage what you have today to create more value and create, better results for your company? Number 4, as another key takeaway, I would say, is normally doing nothing and staying, with the curse of things that we're doing every day, it's not really necessarily going to take us to the next performance level. So challenges that status quo is something relevant, and I think this is more a change management aspect of the change, but definitely challenging that status quo and being open to explore alternatives is something that is happening today, and people is more and more open to look at these opportunities. And finally, as I mentioned before, exploring those new tools, those methods available for easier and more accessible, are easier and more accessible than most people think.
Hugo, I've heard it said that the definition of status quo is the mess we're in. But, it's rather interesting. ISO, our customers, measurement programs, validation programs within the different dynamics of industries, they're really promoting the idea that their suppliers need to be producing in such a manner that they are learning from things. And again, you can't learn when you're not measuring. And if you're happy with the status quo, you're really saying that I'm happy with just barely meeting the 1996 model, I'm not actually putting in a learning curve, a closed loop measurement of what's actually happening and how we can affect that and change it.
Exactly. Exactly. That's a very good point. So one of the things that I wanted to share, and I think we have just a few slides more to share, but one of the things that I wanted to share is a reflection, and it's a reflection in terms of that I hope that it, every person here could somehow spend a few minutes in their internal with their internal teams and thinking about this. So what is your existing maturity level as a company when it comes to data, when it comes to analytics, when it comes to supply chain maturity? So I think one of our approach, at least, and we have created this sort of a very simple model that allow companies to picture themselves and say, okay, here's how I see myself as a company. So the first starting point is companies that haven't really started in this journey, and so companies that for valid reasons, things like, there's no interest, I have no interest to really make progress in my data strategy or in how do I manage my supply chain in general. So, or I have no resources, or I have other conflicting priorities that are consuming my resources today or taking most of my time, and that's okay. That's one of the potential maturity levels that you can observe in your organization. The next maturity level are companies that are crawling. So companies that have disparate systems already in place. They have primarily they operate in based out of spreadsheets, and they are trying to answer the question, what happened? So what happened in my supply chain performance last month, last quarter? What were the main drivers that are explain my cost going up or explain my inefficiencies in certain areas? So the next level of maturity, I would say, are companies that are walking. So companies that have a more mature system that maybe they already implemented an ERP, that they have been working with that ERP for a few years. They have more confident about their data quality. They have been working towards initiatives to improve that data quality. And then they have resources, and they're more focused on the question, why did it happen? Why things happen to me in my performance? And finally, you can see companies that are running. So companies that we believe that are at the highest level in this maturity level, which is primarily companies that have created a supply chain of data, I would say. So they're able to source data, they're able to make data, produce information out of that data. So primarily they have a supply chain of data, right? So they've been able to really secure the fundamental things around data. They have advanced analytics, and they are more focused at this point trying to answer the question about what will happen in the future. Now, regardless of the level that you are today, and you can again reflect in your internal teams with internal teams and open that discussion, but regardless of where you are, every step has different level of risks at the end. So the first one, I would say, for companies sitting in the non-started stage, I would say the risk is sometimes making poor management decisions that are primarily based on gut feeling, and but they have no solid support from data, from facts that at the end help you to make better decisions, right? So the risk that you face if you're sitting in the crawling stage and you remain there and you don't move to the next step is primarily that you're living in a world where you have limited visibility. So you're running your business faced with, and your supply chain based with limited visibility. And that definitely is preventing you to make more improvements in your supply chain. Number three is when companies are walking. So the risk of staying there and not moving the organization forward is the lack of insights. The insights that normally come from more optimized environments when you're really looking at, your forecast, your demand, your future projections, trying to predict what's going to happen. And finally, as I said, the last level, definitely, the more mature, in this case, in this model, the more mature level, there's always a risk. And that risk is how do you as a company remain consistent? So how you as a company don't get back to, walking or, falling through the cracks just because you cannot remain, or the effort for you as an organization to remain consistent is so high that, you go back in to, a lower stage in the maturity level.
Hugo, this is reminiscent of the old adage that, failing to plan is a plan to fail. And, I've heard it said before that, I've heard people say nobody saw this coming, the current condition that we're in our market here in 2020. But as we're sitting here at the year 2020, having a company that is not, started is probably not all that acceptable. It's a risk to the customers of that company, because they're concerned about your ability to sustain the business and really ride through changing times. So not really well prepared. But if you look at some of these crawling and walking and running scenarios, the companies that are walking and running that we're seeing today in the industry are the companies right now that are doubling down. They've been profitable. They've had great measurements in place. They were able to maybe not see it happen as fast as, hey, we wake up this morning and everything stopped. It took a little while for this to happen, but they had their finger on the pulse and they had the systems in place to turn on a dime. So they were able to stop the flow of supply in some cases. So, we closed our factory, we can't have materials continue to arrive. And I know I'm oversimplifying it, but the fact is, whether that be the resurgence coming out of this situation, so managing the downward trend or managing the upward trend, having that information at your fingertips clearly gives you insights and allows you to make some really smart moves. And probably the best example recently I saw was back in February, a colleague of mine, a customer who said, you know what I see? I see a situation unfolding in China that is going to give me an opportunity to buy out all the quantity of product that I need to continue on in my business. And if others aren't doing that, I'm going to. Like, luck favors the prepared mind, and sometimes having cash in the bank and the insights. But having those insights were valuable because they were actually able to see a huge increase in their business because they were able to supply something that nobody else could. And so those are those little opportunities that arise versus, woe was me, we're shut down, I'm not sure why it happened, I have no insights, we're all in this together. I get it, but I think there's a better way to look at this. And I'm always a half full guy looking at the positive, and the companies that look at the positive is because really they've been taking care of their business all the way along. And the companies that emerge from this situation who have been investing and looking into these systems, they're going to emerge stronger. I really believe so. They have the ability to pivot.
I agree with that completely. And I think that's a great example of the opportunities that potentially companies can capitalize when they look at, their performance regularly. Just a few more slides. We're reaching out almost the hour. So I think the message at the end that I would like to share with the audience is don't wait for a new normal. I think my advice could be start now. If you haven't really started this journey yet, start now. If you already started and you pictured yourself in some of those maturity steps, think about moving to the next level. Why not? I mean, I think that's what evolution and continuous improvement in an organization is. So my advice could be similar to when you run, your personal checkups from time to time. I would invite companies to do the same thing for their supply chain. So run a supply chain health checkup. So check for a few things. So check for your decision support tools. So what are the tools that you have today in your organization that allow you to measure your supply chain reliability, your demand behavior, how your customers are purchasing, how are what those patterns are. So look at your inventory visibility. Are you having real time, close to real time inventory visibility about what's going on with your products, with your inventory levels? Customer service levels. So are you monitoring regularly how good or bad are you sometimes serving specific customers and serving specific products? Check for response time. So how effective this process is going. So are you having access to real-time information that allow you to make better decisions, or is basically a batch update that you do once a month, once a quarter? How frequent is that access to information? So it is manual, or is it through an automated system? and the time to decision. So how long does it take for you to make a decision? If you're a decision maker, you're a procurement manager, you're a logistics manager, you're a person in charge of running the supply chain in the company, how long does it take you personally to make a decision based on facts, based on someone providing that information to you or running it by yourself? How long does it take you? And finally, check for data quality. I think that is always important to check for consistent processes internally. Check if you feel confident about your data quality, and assess how those consistent processes are working in your organization. So just pretty much to finalize a couple of more slides. So I don't know, if John, if you would like to share this with the audience.
Sure. You know, I guess what are the action items that you can do? And clearly, we're seeing an uptick in our market because companies are both working remote, but also in need of these systems. And so, you know, it's amazing what can happen in a short period of time that typically took a long time in the past. But, you know, the reality is this health check is a bit of a benchmarking exercise. How are we doing? And how well would we, you know, be able to react in the next time this happens? Because we've heard it before. This wasn't the first. It probably won't be the last. And how well will we be able to pivot and manage? A health check is going to give you some insights. You could have broken processes. You could have broken reliability around your data. So those are challenges if you need that data to make valuable decisions. One of the opportunities we have together, you know, we've partnered up with Hugo and the Owl, is to really bring insights. If somebody's looking for assistance, could you come in, step in, help us really maybe spruce up what, you know, using our existing team, maybe even existing systems. We're not necessarily married to the idea that you need to buy anything, but as a service, how could we help you hone your craft, you know, from a professional supply chain expert to insights about what needs to be measured. Another angle on this is really a proof of concept. If you are interested, if the data insights aren't there for you today, there are tools. And so those tools could be the OWL. They could be a proof of concept of what an integrated ERP system can do. You know, we believe in this crawl, walk, run, but it's really meeting you where you and your organization stand. You may be well underway. That's great. And it may be a different system. That's fine. But how can we help you? And then, you know, finally, that proof of concept beyond just the reporting could be, you know, what does my business look like when we have a single entry of data and it flows all the way through from demand to supply to actual delivery? And how do we measure that continuum based on forecasts and closed loop planning? So, you know, that's what supply chain is all about, is being able to have that visibility. And ERP data is definitely, you know, rallying not just one department's concern, but having everybody in alignment. And so that's a way that we could engage or potentially evaluate us. You know, as we look at change is inevitable. You know, the status quo is no longer acceptable. Your customers need it. Your organization needs it for survival. You know, we know that companies that aren't prepared with visibility may not be around for very long. So really what we need to understand is this isn't just a, you know, write a check, hit an easy button. Supply chain optimization really is a journey. And that journey is really a matter of a starting point of where do I need to go? Everybody may have a different vision of that. Certain industries will force you further, but you don't just hit a button and get there overnight. We get it. Organizations that invest are clearly going to be able to be ready and more resilient. And so they're investing in processes that are consistent, that yield data, that is ready for decision support. And it allows them to see insights. I've had 4 customers come forward, pivot their business because they had certain assets that the world needs today. And so whether it be masks, ventilators, or you know, sterilization, hand wash, etc., we are seeing customers stand up and say, you know what, I have an asset of people, equipment. It wouldn't take us much more to use our existing investment in systems and processes to just insert a new product. And so very interesting, and it does make you more resilient, whether you stick with your existing product lines or you need to pivot. You know, there's an old saying about continuous improvement, you know, whether it be the business moniker of what got you here won't get you there, or what you were doing last year. And literally, as we look at the year 2020 and beyond, what was happening last year isn't going to be the model for what happens for the next year or the year after. We all seek, to get back to a place which we felt comfortable. But, change isn't about being comfortable. Change is about pushing yourself to consider the possible, to consider the impact and scenarios, and to have the data to really make informed decisions. And so really, change is inevitable. And so really, when you ask yourself about what change is going to be important, there's a whole world of APEX, CAPEX, the Canadian version, US version, global version of best practices. And what we as a company, mutually, both Hugo's firm and our firm, bring to the table is insights around what are those best practices and the ability for you to measure yourself against them. What are you scoring? Are you 1 out of 10 in this area? Are you 5 out of 10? Do you need to be a 9 based on your industry? Or maybe you only need to be a 7, but if you're at a 4, there's a gap. How do we get there? Benchmarking could be an opportunity on how we could help you see the gaps. And, whether you take the reins at that point or not, there's an opportunity. So I guess at this point, we've got a number of people on the call. There's potentially a few questions. We've got a few people. If you wish, feel free to text a question. Hugo, I've got a question here, and it's somebody texted in. I don't know where to begin. We lack reporting tools. I'm cutting POs like a Word document. Do you have any insights on how that organization might take the next step or address their journey?
Yeah, I think that's a very common question, and I appreciate the question from the audience, the person in the audience. So my advice could be look at the maturity model that we presented in terms of where you see yourself in the which phase you see yourself. Take the initiative of understanding where your goals are. So what do you want to be, as you mentioned before? So do you want to increase your performance by 5%, 10%? What are the areas in your organization that you're trying to improve now? And then I would say start small. I wouldn't really recommend companies to really boil the ocean and try to come up with a new solution that really create a revolution internally. I would say go to the next step. So the next step, you're sitting in the crawling step. How do you get in the areas that you want to improve to the next step in the process?
Very good. I have another one here. We have an ERP. I probably have the data, but no idea how to get greater insights.
Yeah, I think from my perspective, and I appreciate the question too, in regards to insights, I think, as I explained before, most of companies have already the data available in their systems. Most of the companies. I mean, I've seen companies that are definitely lacking some of the things that I mentioned, but there's only a few, right? So I mean, most of the companies already have a lot of data inside of the organization. The challenge normally is to collect that data, making sure that you organize it in a certain way, and we can definitely help with that if that's the challenge that companies are facing.
Anybody out there? Any other questions? Oh, here's one. I really liked your presentation. I think assessing our situation is urgently needed. Can you give us a call? In the next slide we'll put on here is going to be how to reach us. Are there any other people out there that may have a question? Here we go. We just went live with Epicor, and we have to pull the data manually to process an Excel version, as the analytic tools in the system do not seem to be working, and the instructions are not clear or complete. That's interesting. Maybe that's a joint answer. I think there's a couple different perspectives there. Epicor, like many ERP systems, does have tools to pull data. Dumping to Excel is one answer to doing analysis. But whether you're crafting your own reports, which is pretty basic and low level and probably a slow way to get there, there are tools. So one example would be the OWL, and that's something that we can bring to the table to show a whole library of best practice indices that works with Epicor to help you get to those key decision support places, whether it be measuring your supply base, measuring your fulfillment rates, your reliability, and your ability to serve your customer. Hugo, do you have something you want to say there?
I think just to add to your answer, I think that you're right. So there's tools that are natively somehow connected with the ERP. In our experience, and that's I think the value that solution like the ones that we offer to the market brings is the fact that we do the heavy lifting for the customer, in which sense that we help the customer to organize the data, we help the customer to understand what is the relevant data that need to pull from their system, and also, which is even more important, I would say, our solution brings already the recommended KPIs that best in class companies utilize to measure the key process in the supply chain. I think that's an advantage because definitely adds reduces complexity for the customer and help the customer get up and running with analytics in a very short period of time.
I'd offer that any company out there that has made an investment in ERP, regardless of what it is, clearly understands the status quo was not enough. There is a reason why you made that change. And it's no small feat to get live and running on an ERP. It is probably one of the most difficult things a company can do. But it's actually a logical progression to say, okay, now we have consistent data as an asset. How do we leverage it? And I think you can see how that journey of crawl, walk, run is starting to pick up. And you can go as fast as you like, but you clearly have to kind of go from A to B to C to get there. And congratulations on going live with an ERP. I think you've already got some questions around how you get those insights. I think the system is laying down that foundation every day, every minute. It's now a matter of mining that data, mining that gold that you have. So it's probably why you invested in ERP. So we'd be happy to take that offline and share with you a little bit more information. Any other questions from the group that's left? Well, we do appreciate everybody sticking on and partaking in this presentation. This is part of our series of best practice discussions and tools that can help you get there. Again, you don't necessarily need to invest in a tool, depending where you are in that life cycle. Maybe it's just getting yourself organized and building a case for change, which could be new processes, improved processes that yield better data. But for many companies, that journey does include the formal systems, the formal processes, and then the ability to grab insights that aren't just understanding what's happened, but being able to predict the future of what's going to happen if. And we've seen this before. And, supply chain have been broken before, and they will be broken again. But now with tools and insights, you'll be able to move faster and pivot faster than others. So thank you, Hugo, for your time.
Thank you very much, John, and thank you to the audience for your time. And hopefully, this presentation was valuable for you. Thank you.